Good afternoon, everyone, or wherever you are. Good day. It's my pleasure to introduce Liane Gabora from the University of British Columbia, who's going to speak to us from British Columbia about cultural evolution. You can see the title. Liane will take up to an hour. That will leave some time for questions. Please raise your hands at the end if you want to speak. Welcome, Liane. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and very pleased to speak today. So just to give a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about, the fact that culture does evolve, and it does seem to exhibit key characteristics of biological evolution. However, it does violate necessary constraints for an explanatory framework of natural selection to be applicable. So then we're going to talk about some constraints on a viable explanatory framework for cultural evolution. And then I'll talk about a framework that myself and my colleagues have been developing called Self-Other Reorganization. All right, so culture does evolve. It does exhibit cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change. And human culture surpasses that of other species to such a degree that we can consider ourselves to be participants in a second evolutionary process out of culture. And culture helps us change fast enough so that we can keep up with environmental changes that are too fast for genetic evolution. And in keeping with the dictum, what I cannot create, I do not understand, which was actually written on the underside of Richard Feynman's desk, I decided when I was a graduate student way back in the early 1990s to build a computer model of cultural evolution. And it was the first computer model of cultural evolution. Two people called Hutchins and Hazelhurst had built a computer model of cultural transmission, but there was no cumulative adaptive change. So it consisted of an artificial society of neural network-based agents that learn patterns. They figure out what constitutes a fit action in their current environment. So there was just a fitness function, and they had to learn what that fitness function was, and there could be different needs in that environment that they had to learn. There were a bunch of different things, parameters that could be changed. Each iteration, each agent either would invent a new action based on the knowledge that they had accumulated thus far, and they were able to learn trends and patterns about what seems to be a fit action, or they could just imitate what one of their neighbors was doing. And in some variations, we would have the capacity for them to imitate a leader, so some agent that everybody could imitate to simulate the effects of media and leadership and these kinds of things. So you'd observe the effect of manipulating psychological and environmental variables. And here are two graphs from this early work back in the 1990s. On the left, we see how the mean fitness of the action. So it was actions that they were evolving, because there is a lot of evidence that actions were the earliest form of cultural evolution. And so the mean fitness of the actions would increase over time. And also the diversity would increase as they explored the space of possibilities, and then it would decrease as they would exploit those possibilities. So we can develop a model that captures the algorithmic structure of cultural evolution, and it does exhibit cumulative adaptive change. And I also discovered back then that culture exhibits characteristics of biological evolution. So drift is the phenomenon in biology where there's a change in relative frequencies of variance due to random sampling from a finite population. And at that point, cultural drift had been observed in a very simple mathematical model, but I wanted to see if you would get it in this more realistic cognitive architecture. And so the graph on the right shows the mean activations of the body parts that contributed to these actions. And these are averages across 100 different agents. So high activation indicates leftward motion, low activation indicates rightward motion, and activation of 0.5 indicates no motion. And I've just shown 4 different body parts because if I added more body parts, it would just look too confusing. And I just wanted to display some general phenomena that are better captured this way. So in this in the fitness function that I used in this run, the leftward and rightward motion were equally fit. So moving So actions with no arm movement were inferior. So it was equally fit to move the left arm to the left or to the right. But by the end, all 100 agents, or almost all of them, had converged on moving it either to the left or to the right. And that, you can see, was the same with the right arm, the same with the hips. And for the head, stationary movement was the best. And so that's why the line is just flat. But because either direction was equally fit and they would all go to the left or all go to the right, that shows that the cultural evolution model exhibited drift. And it also exhibited another characteristic found by population geneticists, and that's epistasis, where the effect of one gene depends upon which variant of another gene is present. So the arms are epistatically linked. That is, if the left arm was moving left, it was better for the right arm to move right and vice versa. But as in biology, it took longer for the epistatically linked components, so the left arm and right arm, to stabilize on fit values. So in this particular run I've shown here, the left arm is going to the left and the right arm is going to the right. And look how it didn't stabilize until about 200 iterations, whereas the hips and the head took almost half that time to stabilize. So you not only get drift, you also get epistasis. And this graph shows the optimization time, so the number of iterations needed to reach an optimal output as a function of the rate of conceptual change, which is the average amount of novelty introduced by each new cultural output. And what you see here is that the number of iterations required to achieve the maximal fitness is lowest with an intermediate rate of conceptual change. And so as in biology, you need to balance creativity with continuity. And so culture evolves, and we can build a model of it that captures the algorithmic essence of the process, and it exhibits phenomena found in biological evolution. So how does it evolve? And were it possible to root cultural evolution in a scientific framework, we might arguably achieve the first step towards unification of the social sciences compared with Darwin's unification of the life sciences. And many have proposed that culture or the creative processes that propel it are also a Darwinian process. And that made sense to explore that possibility. Wouldn't it be nice if it was that easy? And in order to explore this, I think it's very insightful to examine the question of what problem did Darwin's theory solve? And so Darwin observed that living things are highly adapted to their environment. So he saw that finch species on each Galapagos island have beaks that make it easier to procure locally available foods. So thick beaks for cracking seeds, long, narrow ones for probing flowers. And moreover, such adaptations would accumulate over time. So you get gradual gradation of beak shape across finch species, suggesting that there was incremental adaptation to that local food source over time. Traits acquired by an organism over their lifetime are not transmitted to offspring. They're lost by lineage. You don't inherit your parents' tattoo. If someone bites your tail off, your children, the offspring are not born tailless, right? So that was the paradox that Darwin faced. How do species accumulate change when traits acquired over each organism's lifetime aren't transmitted? That was the problem his theory was formulated to solve. And cultural evolution doesn't actually face this problem. It doesn't face the problem that Darwin's theory was formulated to solve. So up top, we see that in biological evolution, each generation receives only inherited traits from the previous generation. Traits their parents acquired over their lifetimes are discarded. So once again, Darwin's problem was if newly acquired traits keep getting discarded, how does adaptation occur? But culture doesn't face this problem. So for example, once a new trait, such as a teapot handle, was invented, teapots could thereafter have handles. And so it may seem a little bit presumptuous to explain what natural selection is to the Darwin Club, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because complications creep in and misunderstandings creep in very easily. So natural selection is cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change through differential reproduction of randomly generated heritable variations in a population over generations, resulting in some traits becoming more prevalent than others or selected. So Darwin's genius was to refocus attention away from the individual to the population of interbreeding individuals. So part of the organism's retained, the part we call DNA, and that contains traits that undergo random change from one generation to the next. So fit versions of a trait aid in the competition for scarce resources. Individuals with these traits are better equipped to survive their environment. They leave more offspring. Their traits are selected. So the solution to Darwin's paradox of how adaptation occurs despite acquired traits getting wiped out each generation was, though acquired traits are discarded, inherited traits that enhance fitness are more abundant in the next generation. And we now know why acquired traits aren't transmitted. And von Neumann is probably best known for his work in mathematics and physics, but he actually wrote a book about what is the minimal structure capable of evolving through natural selection, and he called it a self-replicating automaton. So he said that a self-replicating automaton consists of a self-assembly code, so instructions for how to make a copy of the self, which is the source of inherited traits that is interpreted during development to produce a soma or body that houses and protects it. And that soma or body interacts with the world, and then that results in acquired traits. And this self-assembly code, in addition to being interpreted, it can also be copied and to produce another self-assembly code. So von Neumann thus showed why acquired traits are not transmitted. And we see that culture, it involves replication, but it doesn't involve self-replication. So a tool, for example, doesn't replicate itself. It doesn't have this basic structure that von Neumann showed is the minimal structure capable of evolving through natural selection. It doesn't have a self-replicating automaton. And as a brief digression, I just want to compare this to the notion of a replicator. So Dawkins defined a replicator as an entity that interacts with its world, including other replicators, in such a way that copies of it are made. And notice that the replicator concept doesn't solve the problem that prompted the theory of natural selection in the first place, how species become increasingly adapted to their environment, despite that changes acquired during the organism's lifetime are not transmitted to offspring. Notice that a replicator is not a self-replicating automaton. It's not a self-assembly code that is actively translated during development and passively copied during reproduction. And it doesn't explain this signature feature of the Darwinian process, which is that there is no transmission of acquired traits. So a replicator is not synonymous with an entity that evolves through natural selection. And cultural Darwinists, they often refer to culture as a second system of inheritance and even refer to it as dual inheritance theory. But as far as I can see, it's misleading and incorrect to use the term inheritance in a cultural context. So offspring inherit from their parents, even those genes that were never expressed in their parents' own bodies. And so I'll give you an example. If your parents never break a bone, their genes for mobilizing stem cells and producing the proteins involved in bone repair never turn on in their lifetimes, but you still inherit those genes. And so if you break a bone, it's going to heal, even though your parents' bones never did heal. And in contrast, if your parents know how to ice fish, but they don't teach you, you lack knowledge of ice fishing. So this knowledge of ice fishing, like all culturally transmitted information, it's acquired. It's not inherited. We have two systems of transmission. We have one system of inheritance. So if you want to apply the mathematical framework of natural selection, there are some conditions that must be met. And one of them is the requirement of random variation. And many people have talked about this. What I'm trying to do here is combine all of these violations in one, just to see how drastically they're all violated. So the condition is that variations must be random with respect to fitness. So there must be nothing biasing them to be better than they would be due to chance. Otherwise, change is due to whatever is biasing that generation away from random in the first place, not to a selective force that's pruning them down after the fact. And our minds, which fuel cultural change, use strategy. They use intuition, which involves scouring our memories for clues about how to proceed, using patterns detected consciously or subconsciously over our lifetimes. They're generated in a highly non-random manner. And I will not get time to show these slides, but if you're interested, I could. So cultural novelty is generated in a way that violates the requirement for a Darwinian framework to be applicable. The mental operations that exert change in our minds, they operate on such fast timescales. I mean, over the course of a conversation, they can change. You can change your mental concept of something many, many times. And so this is going to drown out any impact of a process that requires generations. It swamps the phylogenetic signal. Even just when you're thinking something through, it's going to change it very many times. That's introducing non-random variation. Natural selection serves as a useful approximation in biology. It works there because novelty is breadth first. So you can randomly generate many variants, and by chance, a few will be better adapted than what exists now. Since human memory and also large language models, that's another talk, learn and retrieve patterns in a context-sensitive manner, there's no need for multiple randomly generated variants. It's a depth-first process, not breadth-first, depth-first. So it uses knowledge, strategy, intuition, and the creative pattern matching abilities of a distributed content addressable memory to reiteratively hone ideas that are useful and relevant. Culture also violates another requirement, that of discrete units and high fidelity transmission. So natural selection is modeled in terms of change in the frequencies of well-defined copyable units. A Darwinian explanation requires that the units be discrete, clearly identifiable, and copied with high fidelity. So cultural units, concepts, ideas, rituals, practices, and so forth can be ill-defined. They can be half-baked. They can be context-sensitive. They're constructed on the fly. And this all makes it impossible to identify discrete units akin to genes. That violates the condition for discrete units. During transmission, an idea is often modified or reinterpreted, and between transmission events, it's often transformed into something completely different. So this violates the condition of high-fidelity copying. And these problems persist even for those rare cultural contents that actually are clearly delineated and copied with high fidelity. And so I'll give you an example of that. Let's say Anne says to Bill, Dave asks lots of questions, meaning, Dave is very interested and engaged in what we're doing. And then Bill then says to his boss, Kathy, Dave is asking lots of questions. But the subtext of Bill's message is, Dave is probing, he may be onto us. So the same words were used. You've got perfect fidelity transmission, but in Dave's mind, the message acquired the non-random trait of expressing danger, which was transmitted to Kathy. So thus, cultural contents rarely meet the criteria of being clearly identifiable and copied with high fidelity. And even when they do, the Darwinian approach is still vulnerable to the transmission of acquired traits problem. It also violates the requirement of competition and selective exclusion. So Darwinian framework requires that different versions of a trait compete to be selected. This is the case in biological evolution. Genes come in different versions called alleles that vie for representation in the gene pool. For example, alleles that predispose their carriers to disease typically are outcompeted by alleles that don't. In contrast, most cultural phenomena cannot be neatly divided into discrete units with alternate versions that compete like alleles. Moreover, our concepts and ideas often coexist. They often mutually support. They sometimes even enable one another. So this undermines a central mechanism of natural selection, differential replication driven by competition. It also violates the requirement for negligible horizontal transfer or lineage isolation. So phylogeneticists, they develop models that assume similarity due to shared ancestry. So they come from a common origin. They have the same vertical descent. Either they're both descended from the same lineage, in which case one is descended from the other, in which case it's presented as further down the lineage, or they have a common origin. So it's a matter of relationship through inheritance or vertical descent. And this gives a nice tree-like branching pattern. So lineages split and diverge, but once they're separated, they cannot rejoin. And shoehorning cultural lineages into such a model, at first glance, it looks like it works, but it misleadingly portrays similarity due to horizontal transfer of knowledge and ideas as similarity due to shared ancestry. And so what you have here is an evolutionary tree of cornets. And what I want you to notice is that in many places they had to draw these curved lines indicating where there was information transfer amongst these cornets. So they didn't have a common origin. They were just horizontally transmitting information between them. And to make those a little bit more obvious, I put the red lines around them just to show how ubiquitous they are. And in fact, often when this kind of approach is applied to cultural phenomena, such as artifacts, what they do is they routinely discard the ones that have new attributes from their analysis. They regard them as outliers, when in fact it's the creative outliers that actually are responsible for cultural change. They're what causes culture to evolve. So recognition that the cultural relatedness is better captured by networks than trees has led to a flurry of network-based and systems-based approaches. Some such models incorporate not just physical attributes, but the underlying conceptual structure. So this is a segment of the conceptual structure of the Baltic psaltery that my colleagues and I used in analysis. And what I want you to notice is that we're not only taking into account the physical attributes, but also the conceptual structure that you would have to have in order to build that instrument. So for example, if you have both scales and you have a beak-like tip, that isn't a coincidence. It's because you have that higher level concept of animalist symbolism. And what I want you to get out of this graph, and we can go back to this later if you have questions, but basically at this point, what I want you to show you is that you can use this network-like approach to model the relationships between these different kinds of Baltic psaltery designs. And when you incorporate the conceptual structure and the symbolic meanings, what you can do is you can recover previously unacknowledged patterns of historical relationship that are more congruent with the geographical distribution and temporal data than what was achieved with other approaches. So cultural evolution explains cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change, it exhibits cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change. And it exhibits biological evolutionary phenomena such as drift. So isn't a Darwin-like model good enough? And I claim that it is not, for two reasons. First, cumulative adaptive change can occur in cultural lineages without the generation of or selection amongst variants. And so this is one of the graphs that I showed you right at the beginning of this talk. And what I want you to notice now is that I could vary the P create value, which is the ratio of innovation to imitation. And so the ratio of the time that the agents would spend that iteration innovating versus imitating one of their neighbors. What I want you to see is that when they are not creating at all, so when P create is 0 and all the time, all they're doing is imitating, well, nothing happens. There's no increase in fitness. And that's shown by the completely flat yellow curve. So if there's no creativity at all and all they're doing is imitating, it's like a high school dance. They're just looking around, waiting for somebody else to start. But if they are creating all the time and not doing any imitation, the cultural evolution is not as fast as it would be if there was this nice blend or nice mix between imitation and innovation. As I said before, culture does exhibit this need for a balance between continuity and change. But as that blue curve shows, you do get cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change over time. And this is even more prominent in this particular graph. So in this graph, and this once again is way back, done in 1993 at the Santa Fe Institute Summer School, what it shows is that if you are the agent with the fittest values, you're on a roll, you're doing your own thing, it's going really well, well then the blue graph is the highest. So your fitness increases the highest. So what does that tell you? That tells you that when you're on a roll and you're really doing well, it doesn't pay to just stop what you're doing, look around, see what everybody else is doing. Just keep on going. So culture can exhibit cumulative adaptive change without any imitation, without any social learning, without any transmission. It's slower, but it happens. So if the mechanism proposed by the theory isn't needed to explain change, the theory isn't explaining. And a second reason is that a theoretical framework should synthesize findings under one explanatory umbrella. It should stimulate new relationships and interpretations and understandings, and it should guide future research. So the Darwinian framework has accomplished this for biology, but it can't for culture, in my view, no matter how many kludgy augmentations we might tack on. And in fact, it is widely acknowledged that cultural evolution research has itself evolved rather sluggishly. So a false scientific framework, it stymies and misleads. Even rigorous analytic tools still give a distorted picture. So what we want is a theoretical framework that doesn't require us to reduce our strategic creative cognitive abilities to random variation, that doesn't misleadingly portray similarity due to horizontal idea transfer as similarity due to common ancestry, that doesn't require statistical gymnastics to explain cooperation among non-kin. I mean, that may be a bit cruel, but in general, I think we can explain cooperation much more easily than has been done. But you might say culture has variation and selection, and it's true. For example, there's many variants of peanut butter in the supermarket, and you select one, and if many people select that brand, the more of it gets made, and the company that makes it prospers, so its fitness could be said to increase. And yes, a framework for cultural evolution must be compatible with this. But that's not natural selection. It's selection in its informal, imprecise, everyday layperson meaning. And I assert that once a term has acquired a scientific meaning, it can only lead to confusion if it gets used in that everyday way. And there are other words that can be used instead. You could refer to informal selection as choice. You could refer to the proliferation of the chosen item using another term such as amplification, and this would cause that confusion to not exist. So then you can ask, why do Darwinian cultural evolution models seem to sort of work? And this graph shows 8 different kinds of cultural change. So in the top row, the small blobs and thin arrows indicate change involving a specific unit of cultural information. In the bottom row, the large bursts and thick arrows indicate change affecting the worldview more globally, or the internal model of the world, or cognitive network, as we're going to call it more globally. So cultural change during expression, transmission, or reception is represented by a change of color from blue to green. And so you have change within minds, change during the expression of the idea, change during the transmission of the idea, and change that happens during the reception of the idea. And it can also occur at 2 levels of analysis. So it can occur at the unit of the cultural level of information or at the level of the mind as a whole. And if you want, during the question period, I'd be happy to go into specific examples of each of these kinds of change, but I don't have time to do that right now. So of these 8 loci of cultural change, cultural evolution research has focused almost exclusively on type 3A. It occurs during one simple unit of cultural information during transmission. And 3A is most readily characterized as random, so there's less chance of horizontal transmission and contamination of thought lineages, so it's less incompatible with a Darwinian framework. Darwinian models are incompatible with figuring something out for oneself. So the emphasis is squarely on social transmission. And they even say culture consists of information stored in brains, information that got into those brains by various mechanisms of social learning. That's it. Everything is in our brains. We got there because someone else told it to us. So psychological processes that these models incorporate are those that affect not the content of ideas, but the probability that they're imitated. So transmission biases, such as prestige bias, that are clearly less impactful than the processes that generate cultural content in the first place. The only way to maintain a Darwinian perspective on culture that is consistent with the algorithmic structure of natural selection identified by von Neumann is to view humans as passive imitators and transmitters of prepackaged cultural units that evolve as separate lineages and change through random processes. Okay, so now we'll move on to the second part. It's shorter. We saw that people are starting to use networks to analyze cultural evolution. We also saw that networks are actually, by their very nature, incompatible with the Darwinian framework because they employ horizontal change. But networks are valuable, and there's many, so basically they consist of nodes connected together by links or edges, and you can identify various different configurations of networks, and you can also identify various different degrees of connectedness of networks, and there are a whole bunch of parameters for characterizing network structures such as centrality, communities, cavities, and so forth. And so that might seem to be a way forward. So what are the requirements then for a network-based theory of cultural evolution? Well, we must be able to model how cognitive networks, our minds, acquire knowledge through individual and social learning and how they generate new mental contents, because those are what fuel cultural change. They must be able to model how cognitive networks, how they emerge in a child's mind. How does a child become capable of being a contributor to cultural change? We must be able to model how they maintain their structure, how they modify and replicate their contents. Must be able to model how individual differences in cognitive networks, which underlie creative outputs, emerge. Must be able to model how cognitive network is transformed through the generation and assimilation of cultural novelty. And in addition, to identify where novelty in a cultural lineage arose, we must be able to distinguish the contents that were just acquired by social learning from the contents that are newly generated in the mind of a particular person. Otherwise, we don't know what that person brought to the world versus what they just learned from other people. And cultural evolution is fueled by creativity. So creativity must be central to a network-based theory of cultural evolution. And it entails something called context-driven actualization of potential, where the latent potential is actualized through interaction with a constraint or context. So let me break that down for you a little bit. So this is how Donald Campbell, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, and it was a valid way of hypothesizing how the creative process works. He called it blind variation and selective retention. So you generate a bunch of ideas and you selectively retain one, and you generate a bunch more and you select one, and so on and so forth. And the research that I've been doing in my lab for the last 25 years, and in addition, research carried out by creativity researchers all over the world is more compatible with another view of how the creative process works. It's more that you have a mental model of the world, and you're given a problem, and you think about it from one perspective or context. You think, oh, what would my grandfather do? And then that leads to a mental operation. You change your conception of the problem based on what your grandfather would do. And then you look at it from another perspective, apply another context. Well, what if I adapt the solution that I used to that problem? And you keep on reiterating. And as you do so, your conception of that problem goes from a state of potentiality to a state of actualization. It goes from being half-baked or unclear to clear and focused. And on the rare occasion, you might come up with two ideas and select the best, but usually, in most cases, I've interviewed hundreds of creative people, talked to them about their creative process. What you're going through is actually something more like what is pictured below. And context-driven actualization of potential has a completely different mathematical framework from that of natural selection. It encompasses learning, decision-making, logic, and creativity, and it can work in tandem, in cooperation with amplification and choice, which are the words that I would suggest using in place of selection and heredity. And one way that this notion of a state of latent potential to an actualized state has been explored is using formal models. And this is yet a whole other talk about why you would want to do that, but there actually is a whole field, and there's a journal and an annual conference and so on of using some of the mathematics and applying it to psychology that was first using quantum mechanics. And it's just like, basically every kind of mathematics. It was first applied in the physical sciences, and then eventually it got adapted. Even complexity theory, it was first used, by physicists, and now it's used to model everything from heart fibrillation to social dynamics, right? So it's just in that spirit of just using some general mathematics and applying it to another domain. And so here we have a vector which represents the state of the concept of Velcro. And in the minds of NASA scientists, they think about the world in a certain way. So the concept of Velcro, you can say, just to explain it without any of the mathematics, but just descriptively, it collapses to something called a hook and loop strip that you can use in a space station to make things attach. But the conceptual space associated with the cognitive network of, say, Puma Shoemaker is structured very differently. They have different problems, different ways of thinking about things, and in their minds, Velcro collapses to shoe closure. Well, you don't need to generate variants and then select from amongst them. You have one state, and it actualizes different ways in different contexts. Now, when you think about it, context-driven actualization of potential, it actually isn't that hard to come by. So a pebble tumbling down a stream, you could say it accumulates the trait of smooth edges. So here is our entity. It's a jagged-edged pebble. And then there's a latent potential future state, which is a smooth pebble. And then this change happens by interaction with a context, which is water and other pebbles. And so you go from this jagged edge pebble to a smooth pebble, but that jagged edge pebble could have had different futures ahead of it. It might have been used to build a house, right? So that's what I mean by things having potentiality, and because of how they interact with context, some of that potentiality gets actualized. It's an alternative framework to natural selection for reproducing cumulative adaptive change. However, the pebble just achieves a simpler, more stable state by minimizing mechanical free energy via abrasion, whereas evolving systems can achieve states that are more complex. So the pebble doesn't benefit from or want to tumble. And in fact, ultimately, this tumbling culminates in its disintegration. So this context-driven actualization of potential, it has to work in conjunction with some kind of structure that is autonomous and able to maintain itself. Okay, so that leads us to the third part of the talk. What kind of structure might this be? So the framework that my colleagues and I have been developing for how this works uses autocatalytic networks. So these are networks in which, through catalyzed interactions amongst the parts, there's a phase transition such that the whole can autonomously emerge, maintain, and grow and regenerate itself, unlike the pebble in the stream. And they have these nice transition points. So it turns out, and this just comes out of graph theory. So if you've ever heard of like Erdos number, Erdos and Renyi, these are the two mathematicians, that's the same guy. And they're the ones that showed that when you have a graph and you're just increasing the number of connections between the nodes of these graphs, they undergo this nice phase transition where they go as as you increase the ratio of edges to nodes, the size of the largest cluster it increases very slowly, and then it increases really suddenly, and that change is called the percolation threshold, where the connectedness is just percolating through the network. And so it can model cumulative adaptive low fidelity replication and evolution in systems with transmission of acquired traits. And using autocatalytic networks, we have efficient algorithms for decomposing complex networks into simpler ones. The approach readily scales up. It can detect and analyze phase transitions in complex networks that prove intractable with other approaches. And there's two domains in which this has been applied. So they were originally developed by Stuart Kauffman to model the origin of life, to model the question of how you go from a bunch of catalytic molecules, how through their interactions with each other, you could get something that could constitute an integrated whole. So that was their first application. They've also been used, they also seem to lie at the heart of a second evolutionary process. So we've also used them to model the origin of culture evolving minds. And in fact, humans do possess two levels of adaptive or self-organizing, self-mending structure. So in addition to the organismal level, our bodies, we have a second level, our psychology or our minds. And in fact, these two levels are sometimes at odds with each other, right? So if you have an artist and they're in the throes of like passion, creating their painting, and meanwhile their hungry children are screaming in the background, well, what that artist is doing is they're listening to the call of culture. And yet they have this other thing for pushing within them, which is sort of the biological part of ourself, which is, the thing that is stopping, that is making them forget to eat or forget to feed their children or look after their children, right? So we have these two levels of adaptive self-organizing structure, and usually they're aligned with each other, but occasionally they're not. And those moments make us more aware of the fact that we have both of them within us. So yeah, so there's these two areas of application of these autocatalytic networks, and they've been applied in many ways to cognitive structures to model the transitions culminating in the origin of a kind of cognitive network capable of evolving culture, to the developmental transition culminating the capacity to be a creative participant in cultural evolution, to model creative thought. I had a Ph.D. student who was in the clinical stream of our program, and she used them to model the psychotherapeutic interactions between a therapist and a client. They've been used to model cultural lineages and discontinuities, and they've been used to model agency in artificial intelligence. All right, each of those is a talk on its own. I'm trying to cram a lot of things in here because I want to present the big picture. So two mathematicians and computer scientists, Mike Steele and Wim Horjic, developed a mathematical refinement of Stuart Kauffman's basic model of autocatalytic networks, and they're called reflexively autocatalytic food set generated networks. And this is the particular kind of network that we're applying to cognition. Why? Because it enables us to track change in cultural lineages, because it distinguishes between food set items which originate outside the network in question. So in a cognitive context, this is innate items or those obtained through social or individual learning, so the raw ingredients with which you build your model of the world. And food set derived items, which are originated within the network in question and in a cognitive context, These are the result of thinking through yourself, whether by logic, by strategy, by analysis, by creativity, because that enables you to model what a given individual contributed to cultural evolution. And the mental operations are referred to as cognitive reactions. So once again, the terminology reflects the initial application to the origin of life. The food set derived items are products of cognitive reactions. The mental contents that take part in cognitive reactions are called reactants. They can either be food set or food set derived. And a cognitive catalyst is whatever triggers a reaction but is not itself altered by the reaction. So for example, it might be that just by chance you would write a poem about your grandmother, but it's more likely if you smell a pie and it reminds you of the smell of the pies that your grandmother used to make. So that smell of the pie catalyzed that cultural contribution, that poem. And so I would just move on to the more informal definition of a RAF. So where a RAF is a set of reactions, a subset is a RAF if it contains at least one cognitive reaction. So it's not the empty set, resulting in at least one product, and all reactants and catalysts needed for each cognitive reaction are present, whether they are food set items, so the things that the individual originally started with, or whether they're food set derived items from earlier reactions. And all of this will become more concrete when I give it an example of it on the next coming slides. So the RAF is a self-organizing, self-sustaining structure that can be built up into larger self-organizing structures, and it has what it needs to preserve and make more of itself. Just a few more terms. The max RAF is the largest RAF in that set of reactions or set of, or in that mind often. You also have sub-RAF, which is a component of a max RAF, and a co-RAF, which is a non-empty set of cognitive reactions that isn't on its own a RAF, but it forms a RAF if combined with something else. All right, so now I want to just, show you how this is used to model a very small cultural lineage. So here is George de Menstruel, and he has a problem, how to make fabric that sticks and unsticks. And so this is depicted as a gap in his cognitive network. And he encounters burdock seeds, and the burdock seeds catalyze this cognitive reaction in his mind, leading to the invention of Velcro. And so the catalyst is shown in red, reactant in green, and the product in blue. And here we have something that qualifies as a RAF. Why? Because there is at least one reaction, and we have all of the catalysts and all the reactants that are necessary for that reaction to take place. And so that's why there's that blue line around it. And here we have NASA, and NASA has problem, a way to stop things from floating away in space. And we also have Puma footwear, which has a problem, a runner that is easy to put on and take off. And so Velcro catalyzes the reaction that it leads to the invention of the hook and loop strip for NASA. And once again, we have something that meets the qualifications of a RAF. And also Velcro catalyzes the reaction that leads to the invention of shoelaceless runners. Once again, we have something that qualifies as a RAF. What I want you to notice is that Velcro is a food set derived item for George de Menstruel because he invented that, right? He came up with that on his own. But it's a food set item for NASA and Puma because they didn't invent it. They just got that from George de Menstruel. So here we see the rafts that connect together, hook and loop strip and shoelace lace runners to Velcro. And then here we have the max raft that encompasses them all. And that's how we model a small lineage using this method. And this picture shows something really interesting. So it's a segment of a cognitive network of a creative leader and an uncreative follower. So A Darwinian approach or other network-based models would give identical models of both, because all they include is stuff that was innate or stuff that was acquired through individual learning of something, just taking something in from the world and incorporating it into your mind, or by social learning, just learning from something from somebody else. But it doesn't include the results of realizing something for yourself. It doesn't include the results of being creative, of figuring something out, being strategic. So what I want you to notice is that you've got the very same items of knowledge in both minds, but once you analyze them using this RAF methodology, you see that their conceptual structure is very different. The one on the left is much more likely to understand how you can adapt some existing solution to a slightly different problem, right? Because it's able to work fluidly with that knowledge. And what this graph shows is how RAF structure can grow and build upon itself. So on the top, you just see, like first you start off with stuff that's innate or acquired through individual learning, and then you acquire something through social learning, and that catalyzes something that you realize on your own, and so that qualifies as one RAF. And then on the bottom row, you get a second RAF, and then they get connected by a co-RAF, and then you've got the max RAF surrounding them all. So I just wanted to give you sort of a glimpse of how you can use this to model the cumulative building up of cognitive structures. And notice that innate items are nurture, food set items are, so whether they be acquired through individual learning or social learning, are what you could call nurture. And catalysis models the conceptual glue, the stuff that you come up with on your own that weaves all of this into a mental structure that is completely yours, that's completely unique. Nobody has the exact same mental structure that you do. And yeah, I'll elaborate on that if I have time. I probably won't have time. So basically, self-other reorganization then is a primitive evolutionary process that enables cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change through context-driven actualization of potential in autocatalytic networks. So replication is fragmentary. It happens when you explain something to me, and that little fragment of knowledge in your mind becomes a fragment of knowledge in my mind. So it's sloppier than natural selection. It's not template driven, but it gets the job done. And it's modeled as transmission of segments of RAF structure. And as I said, there's two manifestations: the origin and a very early evolution of life, and interacting culturally evolving minds. And this is just a little animation that's kind of conceptually conveys the basic idea. So these networks depict individuals. When a network goes gray, that individual dies, but they still leave behind what they put into the world. And also they leave behind the changes that they've made to the networks of other individuals that in turn affect what they leave behind in the world. And this is a comparison of natural selection on the left versus self-other reorganization on the right. So the individuals are indicated by circles. Variation is indicated by different patterns. Darker color indicates better adapted regardless of the pattern. And an X indicates where an entity was selected against, so it didn't contribute to the next generation. And so what you see is that both of them result in cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change. A is much slower, but it's much higher fidelity. Okay. So I did want to get to this point, that there's no paradox of cooperation with self-other reorganization. So for example, the spreading of the knowledge of Velcro increased the demestral's cultural fitness because a fragment of his cognitive network has replicated. But it also benefits the recipients at NASA and Puma because their cognitive networks are no longer plagued by their respective problems. And that means that their cognitive networks are more robust, and they're also more likely to be replicated. So it isn't a survival of just the fittest and the rest perish. It's everybody changes. So there's no need to chase down arduous explanations or cooperation because SORT isn't incompatible with it in the first place. All individuals transform through reorganization and growth internally and through interactions with the world, including others externally. It also can model what is a huge challenge for models of cultural evolution, and that is cultural discontinuity. So that's where you have a break or rupture in the transmission of a cultural artifact or practice. So for example, in the personal transportation lineage, the car isn't a variant of the horse, right? And this, present huge challenges. But cultural evolution is replete with these kinds of discontinuities to phenomena such as cross-domain transfer, which has been studied extensively in my lab. And that's where an output in one domain inspires an output in another. So for example, Tolkien's book, these are just some famous examples. Tolkien's book, Lord of the Rings, inspired Led Zeppelin's song Ramble On. Schubert's Ave Maria was inspired by Sir Walter Scott's poem Lady of the Lake. And in studies of the sort where artists are instructed to paint what the song would look like if it were a painting, participants can match the output with its inspirational source, which shows you that something is getting transmitted, even though the obvious way of categorizing them, the first one and the second one, is very different. And so do I have time to show a model? This is actually the last thing I want to show. It's a model of cultural discontinuity, and it's a discontinuity involving something called the Lowen-Mensch, which is a figurine. It's the oldest known uncontested example of figurative art. Carbon dating puts it at 40,000 years. And it's said to mark the dawn of human imagination. And so what we basically did, very briefly, is we had a bunch of artists, musicians, writers, poets, and so on and so forth. And we gave them information about the Lowen-Mensch, and then we asked them to create works in their respective domains that were inspired by this ancient figurine. And so they did. And then we asked them a bunch of questions about that. But to model cultural lineages, we have to be able to delineate a relationship between the inspirational source and the output it inspires. So how do you delineate what is being transmitted if the inspirational source is a figurine and the output is a piece of music? There may be no obvious continuity between them. The relationship actually reflects a complex web of associations, which is modified during the honing of creative outputs. And so, despite discontinuities at the level of conventional categories, the creator's written accounts revealed 4 through lines, so threads of cultural continuity by which Lowen-Mensch was expressed in different domains. And these 4 threads of cultural continuity are line, human, hybrid, subtracting the whole from within, subtracting the whole to reveal the form from within, deterioration, and the 4th one was waiting with a story to be found. Waiting to be found with a story to tell. And so we modeled that like this. So we had the steps involved in, this just shows the musicians' creative process. So first they had to acquire their background knowledge, deepen that background knowledge. Then they got the instructions to create the figurine. And then we have cross-domain transfer of these 4 different through lines that we identified. And then they're combined to synthesize a piece of music and incorporated the music into a cultural lineage. And this, all of the music and the art and the stories and so forth were actually, as well as the science underlying it, was presented at the Rotary Center for the Arts in Kelowna, British Columbia. And so it was shown to audience members as well. So the figurine catalyzes the restructuring of existing knowledge, which are modeled as reactants, into music, which is product. And this approach makes tangible the role of the arts in metabolizing human experience. So you cannot describe cultural lineages from artifacts alone. You have to look at the cognitive networks which I view as the basic unit of cultural evolution and how they are changing and shifting during the production of cultural art outputs. Artifacts merely provide pointers to the cognitive state. Okay, this is another project we're working on. It's the Techno-Lineages project. So just briefly, some conclusions. In cultural evolution, nothing plays the role of DNA. Nothing serves as a self-assembly code that is interpreted during development and copied during reproduction. So there's no self-replicating automaton. Culture violates the necessary conditions for natural selection to serve as an explanatory framework. Cultural novelty can occur through context-driven actualization of potential in conjunction with amplification and choice. So we proposed a model of cultural evolution through self-other reorganization based on autocatalytic networks and explain discontinuous cultural change by looking beyond artifacts to the knowledge networks that generate them. And this work is elaborated in over 250 papers and in my forthcoming book, Dawn of the Creative Mind, The Origin and Evolution of Culture and Innovation, which is coming out in the coming year from Cambridge University Press. And I would love to hear how these ideas mesh with yours. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liane. That was fantastically interesting. And thanks for keeping it with you packed us an enormous amount of information and ideas, but it was very, very interesting for all of us, I think. Does anybody want to raise questions or speak? Because if there's nobody, we've got a little time, I'll give my own reactions. First of all, I mean, this is fantastically useful. I mean, I don't disagree with hardly anything that you say. I mean, your insights into the mechanisms of cultural evolution and the adaptation are extremely useful and inspiring. Where you and I would differ is that I would want to say that cultural evolution is still Darwinian, okay? But in doing so, I'm not trying to put cultural evolution in the same box as biological evolution. They're not the same. They're very, very different. We both agree on that. Now, I mean, you've put some criteria forward, which in your argument suggest that cultural evolution is not Darwinian. I would suggest that those criteria are too strict. They're so strict that Darwin's biological evolution would not be Darwinian either. Okay. First of all, there's no DNA in Darwin, as we know. Okay. Also, in addition, Darwin embraced the idea of the inheritance of acquired characters. Now, we may think that's not applicable anymore to biology. That's a bit controversial, but Darwin was a Lamarckian, and modern Darwinism is generally different. So if you say Lamarckism or inheritance of acquired characteristics rules out Darwinism, then you must say that Darwin was not a Darwinian. So that's the problem. I think your criteria are too strict. And let's start with the notion of selection. You gave a definition, but there's two works which you didn't mention on selection. One is Elliot Sober, a philosopher of biology. In the 80s, he produced a book called The Nature of Selection. The other one is the work of George Price, also talked about what selection was. Now, with Sober, you got a key argument, which I didn't see you recognizing, is selection is in a sense a confused concept, because as Sober argues, there's two different things going on. There's one is, in biology, we now know it's selection that results in within a population a different distribution of DNA. That's selection of or selection for a DNA change in the population. There's also selection of things, entities, like a species might die out, or a subspecies might be superseded by another subspecies and pushed out. The selection of individuals, both in human society and in nature. My argument about Darwinism will go above individuals, maybe institutions, networks, or call it what they want. But there was no selection of individuals in your early simulations, right? So you ruled out selection in your simulation. Nothing wrong with that because you were talking about important processes, but you ruled out selection by not allowing any of these individuals to die. Okay. So selection involves two kinds of selection according to Price. One is subset selection. When you do select peanut butter off a supermarket shelf, that's a subset selection, which is a weak version of selection. There's a stronger version of selection, which we call successor selection, whereas it's intergenerational change. You start off with a primary set, and you get an anterior set, an anterior set, and you get a posterior set, which is related in some complicated way, and Price explains this. The two sets are related, but it's a temporal change and shift between two sets. So you didn't talk about selection, as I understand it, from this literature. And in some senses, selection was excluded from your models.
But you're making so many points, and I have responses to each one of them, but I'm forgetting what the response is to the earlier ones.
That's fine. Let's break it up.
So one thing that some cultural Darwinists have done is they've gone on and talked about gene culture coevolution, and I think until we understand how culture evolves, you're just doing that is like if you're halfway through writing a novel and you go down and start editing it at the line level. Because
you talk about Boyd and Richardson. Talk about Boyd and Richardson, okay? Yeah, but I mean, Darwin didn't understand anything.
No, I'm not just talking about them, but but I think we have to understand how culture evolves and have a solid framework for how culture evolves before putting them two together. So that's why, I mean, this computer model was done 30 years ago, right? In 1993, a little bit over 30 years ago. So yeah, it didn't include death of individuals, but I think that would have confused the two because I wanted to understand how culture evolves in and of itself. And then after we understand that, then we put the two together. So that's the approach that
but Darwin didn't understand how biological entities evolve.
Yeah, but it's a subtle issue here, and if you notice what I said on my slate, and we now know that this happens because of DNA, but he did know that something does get transmitted despite that something is retained, despite that something is lost. And in fact, you can call it Darwinian if you want. I think that's confusing the issue, but in reality, Darwinian evolution is just a model, right? Natural selection is just a model, and what do they say? Some models are useful, but what is it? Anyway, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful, and it's whether or not the reality can be simplified, whether or not the model actually captures something about that underlying reality. And I think for biology, it definitely does. And we are biologically evolving organisms as well as being participants in the second evolutionary process, culture. So of course, we're subjected to and in fact, the second evolutionary process, it runs piggyback on the first evolutionary process, right? So of course, we're going to be subjected to biological constraints, and those are going to play a big role in our behavior, of course. What I want to do is just to isolate culture as an evolutionary process and abstract the algorithmic essence of that process and see how that works before putting the two together again.
Yeah, you don't need to argue against Lamarckism, against Darwinism here. I mean, what you're doing is fantastically useful for the reasons you've just said, because you're trying to explain in more detail with particular varieties how cultural evolution works. That is hugely stimulating and hugely important. But you don't have to exclude the possibility that for some reason, whether it's useful or otherwise, this could be called Darwinism.
I think that's confusing, but in the end, what it's called doesn't really matter, right? It's whether or not the words that we use can aid in communicating.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you may be interested in looking at my work on that, but does anybody else want to come in here? No. Stephen. Stephen?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My computer is being slow. I thought it was very interesting. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so some of the stuff is going right over the head. But I did want to mention I was very intrigued by your comparisons to biological evolution, as you might guess. And the one thing I thought that um, is not necessary. So there is the observation of biological evolution and Darwin's idea of how that occurred through the process of natural selection. And the question is, what parts of biological evolution are necessary for the process that Darwin explained to occur in other contexts, right? And I think that random variation, the generation of variation through randomness, is not one of those things. I think variation is the important part, not its generation necessarily. And I think as you point out with the notion of people independently coming up with an idea, not being transferred to them by someone else, is a mechanism of creating some more variation. And I think that's the important part, not if it's random or not. And personally, I think the ability of cultural evolution to evolve so quickly could be through directed variation, where just like that, where
Yeah, sure. It
cognitive
would evolve
entity,
more quickly, for sure.
right.
But to
And
the
that also
extent that
leaves,
you've got directed variation, you're violating civil rights requirement that generation be randomly variation be randomly generated. And the reason why, and so when I was a graduate student, I would develop these little, I was a teaching assistant for a population genetics class, and I would develop these little computer models that would show exactly why it would vary all these parameters. And the reason why, that, if the variants are being generated non-randomly, what that means is that the change is due to whatever is biasing that random the change over time is due to whatever is causing that variation to be non-randomly generated in the first place. So what's contributing to the final outcome is less a matter of selection pruning them down after the fact. And so that's what
I
these
would disagree with
mathematical
that.
models show.
I would disagree with that personally. I mean, I think you
Well,
have
that's in
variation.
contradiction with some of the basics of population genetics.
Well, I'm a population geneticist, so I would not agree with that. So there's variation and then there's selection, right? And so you could have a directed variant that's not selectively advantageous, and that's not going to drive anything, right? Adaptation. You just have a generation of variation, and then selection operates on that variation. That's what we believe in evolutionary biology. So
I don't doubt that. But if you have something that is biasing the generation of variants to be non-random, that is causing them to be that is directing it, then to the extent that change is due to whatever is bringing about that force that is causing the variation to be non-random, then what's happening change over time is due to that. It's not due to the selective pruning of them after the fact.
I guess if you're right, if all variant types were being pushed in one direction and there weren't any other variant types, then I completely agree with that. Yeah. But the bottom line, I was trying to point out that in biology, the randomness part, well, not necessarily in biology, generally for the selective process, like the generalized Darwinism argument, it doesn't have to be randomly generated. And the notion that you can have directed variation could also allow the fidelity issue to be a little bit more relaxed, in my opinion. So that was
In
another
addition,
aspect.
I'm aware of these augmentations. I'm just saying that to the extent that you bring these things in, it is less compatible with the basic framework of a Darwinian explanation.
but Darwin never mentioned random variation. It doesn't appear in his work. He mentions
Right. So,
variation.
but it was some decades later that his basic
that's right.
ideas were
That's right.
mathematically formalized, and there's where random
right.
variation does come in. Yeah.
Okay. Jan Willem. Yeah, Willem?
Yeah, it also took a moment to come in. Thanks a lot for your talk. As was said before, really interesting, very stimulating. I could go on with some of the earlier discussion. I'm more or less in line with what Jeff and Stephen said on these issues. But I think David Sloan Wilson also had his hand up, but I guess he had to leave. And I want to take it into a direction where maybe he would have taken it there as well. I don't know. I'm guessing, which is that you also mentioned cooperation, and I was sort of waiting for you to say, oh, she's also going to say something about cooperation. And as I understand it, that's also the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. When we're talking about cooperation, this is about people sort of solving collective action problems and going beyond their self-interest and being able to sort of form cooperative groups. And I think this is one of the big issues where, for me at least, a combination of the work of David Sloan Wilson, but then later Boyd Richardson, Joe Henrik, and what have you, Leyland, etc. So the cultural evolutionist, I think they have a very, very compelling explanation of how cooperation in general evolved, but specifically where the culture comes in, how human cooperation evolved. And at the beginning of your talk, you seem to suggest that you also have something to say about that. But then when you mentioned the word cooperation, it seemed to be about something very different. So for me, most of what you've been discussing seems to be about material culture, artifacts, etc. When we talk about cooperation, the way that I just talked about it, it's more about norms. It's about the effect on groups forming and then groups having to compete with each other, some groups being selected out at the group level in order for cooperative behavior to emerge, and what economists would call social preferences, moral sentiments, or what have you. So to come to does your approach have anything to say about cooperation in that sense?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's a lot more to do there. I would like to explore that a lot more. I mean, I think it's basically the point I wanted to make is that this framework is compatible with cooperation because basically when I come up with something that is adaptive and if I share it with you rather than keeping it for myself, then that benefits you, but it also benefits me. And so I just wanted to give a simple example of that. But I haven't studied cooperation in detail. I mean, I know a little bit about Simpson's paradox and these kinds of things. But one of the things that I sort of was thinking when I put, I'd love to hear how these ideas mesh with yours on the previous slide. I was actually thinking of that. I was thinking I would really love to work with people who have thought more deeply about cooperation and explore them in this context.
Yeah, so what I find attractive about what you're saying is that you're going to these, I think it was on your last slide, but the cognitive networks or whatever you call them. Yeah, but so to me that makes a lot of sense. That's I think the missing link in a lot of, certainly on the work on cultural evolution that's looked at actual artifacts. Yeah, there's ideas about you had examples of instruments evolving, and it's sort of these lineages, and to me what's always been missing in that work is where are the actual human agents, and where is the information that's actually being transmitted between humans that then sort of shows up in these nice artifacts like the instruments. So I find that very, 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 very appealing in that sense. I also completely buy your idea that there are no replicators in the von Neumann sense. I think that's also Jeff and I have sort of small quarrels at that level of detail. But it would be I would find it very intriguing if you could give an account of cooperation that would also challenge what the cultural evolution people have done. So the Joe Hendricks of this world, etc., who have been explaining in part by working with economists how people that we always presumed were self-interested can still evolve cooperation and go beyond themselves, etc. I think your cognitive structures should obviously play some role in that story, but I would be very surprised if you could give an explanation of cooperation without going back to some sort of what Jeff would call a general Darwinian framework where there is variation, selection, retention at multiple levels, at individual and group levels. It might be worth a shot. If you can pull that off, it would be quite an achievement. But I don't see how you would you have any traction on these sorts of, in your own minds, intuitively, would you have any tractions on these sorts of problems?
Well,
so how people solve multi-person prisoner dilemmas, for instance.
Yeah, I'm just talking to my colleague Mike Steele, who is a mathematical biologist, and we've been talking about writing up a paper on exactly that. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in this direction. I don't think you need a Darwinian framework to explain cooperation, but that said, there may be some of these ideas that have been developed by people who do adopt these framework. I think they also be playing a role in cooperation. I mean, there's probably not just one reason we cooperate. There are probably many interacting reasons, and it would be really interesting to explore how all these perspectives shed light on this, huge and fascinating and relevant problem. I mean, I think it's a really important problem, because if we think that it's survival of the fittest, then I think people act more competitive. And if we understand that if we have a framework for cultural evolution that's actually compatible with the cooperative aspects of our nature, then I think people will sort of more readily feel that they are deep down a cooperative being, and then they might behave more cooperatively. I don't know. That's how some of the thoughts that I've had.
Liane, that's in Darwin. That's in The Descent of Man, where he extensively discusses, uses natural selection, as Jan-Willem said, on groups to explain cooperation within groups. Now, I mean, that's been hugely controversial and it's been debated and still is, but David Sloan Wilson's work and others shows plausible mechanisms for how this operates. And by the way, Jan-Willem, I don't agree exactly with von Neumann's definition of a replicator, but that's as another side point. But I mean, back to the cooperation issue.
It's not. He doesn't call it a replicator. He calls it a self-replicating automaton. But I'd be interested in knowing more specifically what you disagree with.
Well, I haven't got time to discuss my definition, but it's in Darwin's Conjecture, the book I read with Chilbur Knudsen, definition, why we define replicators the way we do. And it's inspired by a large literature on the meaning of replicator, which is post-Dawkins in the philosophy of biology. And there's a big literature which we used. I mean, we stood on the shoulders of others to develop this concept. But I mean, I think Jan-Willem's point is just as important. I mean, I think it'd be very nice if you meshed your work with this work on cultural evolution, which purportedly explains the evolution of cooperation.
If you have a paper on that, I would really love to see it.
And well, have you read David Sloan Wilson?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're referring to something that you did on cooperation specifically.
I mean, we write on cooperation in Darwin's Conjecture. Okay. In the book. Okay. David Sloan Wilson's famous book is with Elliot Sover, who I mentioned, and two others. And you may know that book, and probably do. 1999, I think it came out, or 1998, over 20 years ago. But he's done lots of work since. That would be a very nice dialogue to have. And that's why I think to wrap up, it's been a great session because we've had our ideas challenged and been able to think, not only think about what you're saying in terms of describing things in general terms, but also looking at the immense insight and detail you've done on this in this area, and that's been fantastic. So thank you very much indeed, Liane. It's been a great session.
Well, thank you to you for your thoughts and comments and questions. They've got me reflecting more deeply about where to go with this. And yeah, as I said, I would welcome future collaborations on really developing, all these ideas.
We welcome that too. So we'll be in touch.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.